I typically like to say that, people are like, I'm a type A. I'm like an A minus B plus kind of personality where I just constantly always try to figure out like what to do next, in the sense that like I really enjoy engaging and just learning and getting a ton of inputs for things. As far as like what I do, it's actually a pretty complicated response for me, like all the time. Right now I have my hands in a couple of things where I just wrote a book called Working with Feelings. That's been really cool. So I've been trying to get really comfortable with being called an author. I'm back in school pursuing my master's to become a therapist. And then I'm also consulting, and that primarily consists of working with companies to essentially create better working environments. So other than that, born and raised from the Bay, moved out here 10 years ago, and I still like New York, so that's cool. When I think about the intersection of tech and wellness, for me, it was very serendipitous. It was not by any means an intentional move. And I would say that when I think about my own mental health and when it comes to like working in tech, it was probably very dismal. And I think because of that, I've been such an advocate for it. And so in terms of like making it work, I think wellness and mental health are inextricably tied to our work identities. And so you can't separate the two. What I try to bring into particularly, I guess like tech spaces or anything adjacent to that is the concept that we're all learning and that we all have a lot to give and receive. And I think it's all about just like, quite frankly, caring. I think fundamentally when I think about what we need more of in the workplace is caring. I would say caring is the string that weaves everything together. So I know that my mental health is not doing too hot when I know my apartment's a mess. I think I often feel like my apartment seems to be a reflection of my mental being. And so when it's a mess, I'm like, okay, something's up. So I think I'm a pretty efficient person, and I'm pretty good at what I do. And when I start to feel like I am losing control of it, then I'm like, okay, there's something up. And sometimes it's not as immediate as like, oh, it's a work-related thing. It could be things happening outside that start to really seep in. And so you have to take notice of that. I probably cry first, but in terms of like really taking notice of it, I tend to start to feel very isolated, and I have this kind of looming feeling, and I've had anxiety since forever. So I know when I'm shifting from like a 7 to 10 because I start to physically have somatic symptoms. For years and years, I'd wake up with like deep, heavy heaving, just naturally, no reason. And so whenever I am stressed or I know that it's like something's tilting towards something, I start to have those symptoms. So it could range from like heaving really heavily to like coughing. And again, it's not a reason, I just know that something is causing this anxiety. So I find that healing and care is super relational. And when I say relational, it means being able to heal or figure things out with friends, therapists, all the folks in your life and your support system. Because I think doing it alone is so hard. And sometimes all you need to do is talk about it. And if there's anything I've ever learned about anything, particularly actually from Mr. Rogers, is that if you can talk about it, then it's manageable. So I kind of take that to heart. Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for teaching me something. The first line of my book, first sentence. I like to think of myself as someone who kind of has their shit together. So, opening line, introduction of Working with Feelings. How did I get there? I think it's just at some point you kind of have to be honest with yourself. And like I said, I always thought I was an A minus B plus. And so the kind of got their shit together felt like on brand for me. And when I moved to New York, I was a 22-year-old, super ambitious, inspired to do everything. And I was like, I got this. New York does its thing and makes you realize that sometimes you don't. When I think about my career in the last 10 years, I often go back to that feeling of like, I like to think I kind of have my shit together, but I think the reality is like sometimes. So, I think some of the challenges when you start to really label yourself as someone who has their shit together is that you are afraid to let things fall apart, or this internal fear that you lose control. And I think that feeling is so underestimated because it ends up impacting our lives in so many ways. So I think when you have that mindset, it makes it challenging to A, recognize it, B, ask for help, and C, move forward from it. It just becomes this like internal drive. And one could argue that it's like decent motivation, but at what cost is always kind of my thing. I think it's great to be driven in all those things, like absolutely. But I also think that if you're so into that and you start to ignore the things that drive you, whether that be your spirituality or the way that you love, then I think then it starts to be a little harmful. And I think sometimes all of that is subtle, right? You don't know that it's bad until it's bad. I think a lot of that's because, again, fear of like losing control, losing grasp of these things. But sometimes like most of life is not exactly how you plan. There's not been one moment where I was like, I planned to do this and this came out exactly. And when I think about, you know, becoming a therapist, what are some things that I've really taken to heart? The first is that you can change your mind. I think we're so conditioned to think that we have to live and act towards the narratives that we set for ourselves and that we can't change your mind, but the reality is that you can. You can always change your mind. So, and I say that to say that it's really liberating to know that you have the option, because sometimes all the options are in front of you, but you only choose the option that you're conditioned to choose. At the start of the pandemic, a friend had sent me this quote, and I'm butchering it, but the last piece of it, it's from a theologist. To be spiritual is to be amazed. And when you think about your central nervous system, when you think about what actually can tend to like start to shift perspective, it is about those glimmers of awe. Again, when I think about what I've learned these last couple of years is one, like you can change your mind, and two, like embrace the awe of things and know that to be amazed is to truly be spiritual in that sense. I will say that therapy, first and foremost, shout out to my therapist for grounding me. I know this is always a complicated topic, but I believe in SSRIs and like taking medication if it's right for you. I also think it's a holistic approach. So I would never say just go on medication without like really understanding the impact and also like the root of it. But also when you have really intense emotions, sometimes you just need a shift. And by that I mean like there are days where I will maybe feel something so intensely, whether that's sadness, disappointment, and I genuinely just like dunk my face in super ice cold water just to change that feeling in my nervous system. Because sometimes a lot of it is just that I feel it so passionately and deeply, but I just need to like change it. So that's been like a really tactile experience for me, is to like genuinely dunk my face in cold water to stop feeling the way that I'm feeling. And then as far as like other things, I sometimes also just like to cry. Crying is like one of my favorite hobbies. So sometimes I'll just fire up Channel Orange and start crying, because why not? I did one of those meditation spaces, and like generally speaking, I'm like for meditation, but I did those spaces where it's like super colorful and all that stuff. And like I had a panic attack straight up. I was like, no, thank you. And when I say panic attack, like I was starting to hyperventilate, and like being alone in my thoughts in that context, I felt also weirdly pressured to like feel like I had to have an epiphany in that moment. And so not fun. But I genuinely think that if meditation in that context is helpful for you, do it. But for me, it was very anxiety inducing. Always having a little faith. And by that, I don't mean it in like a religious sense, but having faith in myself, having faith in that I can do the next thing, having faith in others, and having faith in the fact that hopefully fundamentally we're all trying to help each other. Because I feel like if I started losing this idea of faith, then I think I'd be probably really sad and I probably should get some help. And then I also think just like knowing that I need therapy, and that like not everyone's gonna be willing to listen to my own shit, because sometimes I don't even want to listen to my own shit. And so I think just extending that kind of grace to myself to be like, it's okay. I think one of the other things I feel like has been a great reflection of my own journey in mental health is like I have a complicated relationship with my parents, and in the last couple of years being able to actually have a relationship has been really fascinating to me, because of the fact that it shows how much I've grown and how much they've grown, and like looking at my parents as like actual adults and not just like my parents. And I think that to me has been the hugest sign of like growth. You know, I think just to be able to forgive and move on in a different way, it's cool.